Hello, welcome to this podcast where we shall learn about the conservation efforts of mangrove forests in Kenya and Brazil and how the local communities in these two parts of the world take care of this critical ecosystem. My name is Steve Mokaya and I spoke to Dr. Margaret Awuor and Professor Angelo Bernardino, two National Geographic explorers who went to the Amazon to learn how Amazonians care for their mangroves. The 7 million square kilometer Amazon rainforest is the world's largest tropical rainforest, famed for its biodiversity. It's crisscrossed by thousands of rivers, including the mighty Amazon. Mangroves in Brazil cover 1,200 square kilometers, double the area of Kenya's mangrove cover. However, their roles are identical, the most significant being carbon sinks, thus reducing global warming and climate change. Globally, mangrove forests sequester as much as 22.8 million tons of carbon each year, according to the latest figures by the United Nations. Besides, they act as coastal erosion shields, afford communities protection from storms, and act as nurseries for a myriad of wildlife in marine systems. In July last year, Dr. Margaret Awuor, a Kenyan National Geographic explorer, went to the heart of the Amazon to research and map the mangrove forest and learn about its significance to the Amazonian communities.
Our work in the Amazon was led by Professor Angelo in Brazil, and for me it was the first time to be in Brazil and to be in the Amazon.
But how did Awuor get to become a National Geographic explorer?
I came to be a National Geographic explorer in 2018, just after I completed my PhD and I'd done my research on mangrove ecosystem services. I think it was the first piece of work done on assessment of ecosystem services of mangroves along the Kenyan coast using the kind of approaches that I used.
But before that, she did research about mangrove in Kilifi on the Kenyan coast before she would later head to the Amazon.
I learned through a friend of National Geographic grants, early career grants. I applied for one of the grants, and through that, I got to do research in Kilifi, in Mombasa, Mtwapa region. I began my journey as a National Geographic explorer.
In the Amazon, she was in the company of marine ecologist and fellow explorer Professor Angelo Bernardino, among others, with whom they surveyed mangrove systems in Brazil's Amazonian estuary, Croatia. Their central aim was to learn about local communities' perceptions of the importance and value of mangroves and how people interact with them.
We usually hear more about the Amazon rainforest. It's a huge importance because, as you said, it covers an enormous area. It's surely important in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate. And now with this program with National Geographic, they like it said, they wanted to look more into the aquatic ecosystems, and then we had the chance to look at have a closer look into these mangroves. Mangroves are one of the most important aquatic ecosystems on the coast of the Amazon.
For 10 days, the explorers interviewed 200 participants as part of the National Geographic and Rolex Perpetual Planet Amazon expedition, a 2-year scientific and storytelling journey spanning the entire Amazon River basin.
When you talk to them, you learn so much how the ecosystem is changing, right? They often report getting less fish and seeing destruction of trees and seeing deforestation in some areas. So they are like local leaders who teach us so much about how the ecosystem is changing a long time. We can find academic and scientific explanations for these things and how fish would, become scarce in the Amazon. But they are there and they are seeing these changes through time.
In Brazil, Angelo says the communities along the Amazon River basin depend on the mangroves for nearly everything.
And one particular interesting thing about northern Brazil is that it's the poorest region in the country, right? The communities are so simple. They are like very, very vulnerable socially vulnerable in terms of income and in terms of government help assistance. So the mangroves are really important for their daily lives. So it's often that you ask them what they get from the mangroves, and essentially it's almost everything.
Awuor says that unlike in Kenya, where the coastal communities cut down the mangroves for timber, the Amazonians greatly respect their mangroves, something she wishes could be adopted at home.
What caught my attention in terms of the difference was how they give respect to their mangroves. You know, like you'd walk into the mangroves and you find dead wood fallen on the swamps, and no one is speaking. You know, like there was no use for a lot of timber, fuel wood, for example, like in Kenya, where we would still cut mangroves for building and construction. So this was very different, and just how passionate, you know, they're quite attached to their mangroves. So the difference was coming out in terms of how they're using. Because when I did the research in Kenya, you could see that issues around harnessing mangroves for fuel wood was coming out, in particular in Mida Creek, where we did the research, and also in Tuapak, Kilifi, where we also did a research on mangrove ecosystem service assessment. But in Brazil, in the Amazon, this was not coming out.
Angelo attributes the moderately good condition of the Amazon mangroves to the high tide surrounding them and the proper knowledge of the communities in the area.
The Amazon is not so disturbed because it's very isolated. It has a huge tidal range. So it's very hard to do construction along the Amazon coast because the tides, they have an enormous variation daily, like from 6 to 8 meters high. So it's very hard for you to build anything. So the Amazon region has remained relatively isolated from people, from settlement for a long time. These mangroves have been protected for some time. I think the communities have had a long time of learned how to use them in a sustainable way to get their food, get their living without having to deforest, to cut the trees off.
Awuor says that from her mangrove research on the Kenyan coast, the communities around the mangrove forest say they will better conserve the forest if they got alternative trees for timber and wood.
In our study, we found out that the community were willing, if the government will support them, to grow trees on upland, which they would use as alternatives to the mangroves, because they don't have, there's one big coastal forest, terrestrial forest, Arabuko Sokoke, but also it's degraded. So they hoped that they would be supported by the government to grow other tree species to be a source of timber for them.
In Brazil's Amazonian villages, the communities have put the area close to their mangroves under agricultural production and are, therefore, some sort of a buffer zone for the mangroves. These communities, Awuor explains, grow cassava, which does great in the terrestrial land away from the mangroves hinterland.
The cassava is grown on land that is adjacent to the mangroves areas, on land, not offshore, on land. So away from the mangroves. You know, the mangroves are the hinterland. Then when you move up to the lands where communities are living, so this is where they have farms where they are growing the cassavas. The cassavas are also another form of alternative income for the communities. They have like an association that is supported by the Ministry in Brazil of Agriculture, and they're producing very big cassava. And with this cassava, they treat it through a very nice process, and then they produce so many products that they use on their meals.
The cassavas were tried in Kenya, but their farming failed, which Awuor attributes to a lack of knowledge. She hopes and wishes that the crop is reintroduced, and with proper government backup, it could ease pressure on the mangroves along the coast, as it will be an alternative form of livelihood and even income.
Yeah, I remember when this cassava was introduced, it killed people because you can't eat it raw as it is, like the other species that we grow here and people eat. You have to wash it and remove all this cyanide that kills people. I remember in Kenya, there's a time cassava was killing communities because their tummies were swelling. So I bet maybe they didn't know how to treat it. But for me, if it is well embraced, so if it's something that can be adopted and people be trained by the Ministry of Agriculture, I think it will be a very good source of income for the local communities. Yeah.
Brazil is definitely doing better in the conservation of the mangroves. Still, Awuor says Kenya has more conservation groups and therefore a lot of the harm done to the ecosystem can be reversed with lessons from Brazil.
In Kenya, we have community-based conservation groups that are already existing. I bet this is because of the changes in our acts in terms of conservation. In Brazil, not so much. It's mainly fisher groups. So there are a lot of things to learn, which would be very important because you know that mangroves only cover tropics and subtropics. So if we can be able to enhance the discussion across these different regions for the conservation through the lessons that we are learning from each country, I think this would be very, very important for us.
Besides fishing, the Amazonian communities also catch crabs for food. However, Angela said that sometimes they learned in the survey some of them do predatory crab catching, which harms the crab larvae.
Crab harvesting is it's a big source of protein to communities on the coast, along with fishing. What they do is the crabs are into the mud, right, in the mangroves. They tap the holes of the crabs, so they get suffocated in there. And eventually they're gonna go out. And then when they go out of the hole, they catch the crab. The problem with this is that, as I said, it suffocates not only the crab, but it decreases the oxygen of the water inside the hole. And the water inside these holes are where the crabs release the larvae. So when these people do that, they tap these crab holes, they are killing thousands of crab larvae that would otherwise survive and replenish the stocks.
Awuor said the research from the Amazon will help inform decisions and policy formulation around coastal areas, especially in ways in which human development can be intertwined with mangrove conservation.
It's very important to know that, okay, if we destroy, for example, mangroves, we already know that they are important source of fisheries for the local communities. You know, they are breeding places for fish. So if we destroy them, like in many of the countries you're talking about, like Africa, Brazil, there's a lot of development in terms of infrastructure that is coming up. So ecosystems are vulnerable as much as the communities are vulnerable. They could pave way for roads, for example. They could pave way for harbors or ports. So if you show this with the maps and be able to explain that this is what the people have said that they're benefiting or they're getting from this ecosystem, is there a way that the development, for example, can come in but not destroy, or they can be integrated so that the development coexists with the ecosystem through different techniques that are coming up, which we can use. So the information is not only for the community to show that they're benefiting, but also to be able to speak to the wider community, for example, of decision makers, policy makers, and also the community members themselves be able to speak for themselves, because for a long time, we speak for communities, but they also need to speak. They've been coexisting with these ecosystems for the longest time than most of us there know.
That brings us to the end of this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks for your company. My name is Steve Mokaya, and until next time, goodbye.